What is the fatal flaw of utilitarianism? Well, first of all, you got to find out, in case you don't already know, what is utilitarianism in the first place, who are its biggest proponents, and how is it applied to real life situations, and why is it problematic? That's what we're going to talk about in this video today. Thanks for joining me. And utilitarianism is a philosophy that really became big in the 19th century because of these two men, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, otherwise known as J.S. Mill. And they were very much connected to each other because Jeremy Bentham, both of them are British, by the way. Jeremy Bentham's best friend was James Mill. His son was John Stuart Mill. And so basically Jeremy Bentham was like an uncle to John Stuart Mill. In fact, he actually was his godfather. So these two are very much related to each other. And before we get into exactly what utilitarianism is and why it's problematic, I want to give you a couple of real life situations. And before I give you kind of the Christian Thomistic perspective on this, I'm just going to kind of leave it out there for a second, okay? So let's say grandma is diagnosed with Alzheimer's and she's 75 years old. The doctor says she might live another 15 years and she's going to slowly degenerate mentally. Her quality of life is going to go down. It's going to be very expensive to keep her in a home. And he suggests euthanasia because really there's not much quality of life. She probably doesn't prefer to live this way. And so if you euthanize her, it won't be as expensive. It won't require so many visits. The family is going to be, burdened by all of this. And so maybe that's what you should, consider. Okay, that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is college senior, brilliant young lady who is going to be the valedictorian. Big things are expected out of her, and she's going to go off to grad school and write theses. She's probably going to be the person that cures the world of cancer because she's that brilliant, and by golly, she gets pregnant, right? She has a pregnancy test, and somebody says, that baby is going to kind of ruin all your plans, okay? And can you imagine the good that you would do if you weren't burdened by having a baby, okay? So kind of keep these two, kind of real life situations in mind as we talk about utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, again, British, the father of utilitarianism, and he had what's called the greatest happiness principle. And it goes like this. Individual happiness consists in achieving the greatest pleasure and the avoidance of the greatest pain to the greatest number of people, right? Sounds good in itself. Do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people and minimizes the most pain, okay? So in and of itself, that sounds very appealing. And this is a direct quote from one of his books. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They govern us in all that we do and all that we say and all that we think. Now, if you have a background in Christian philosophy, that should immediately start raising some alarms, because really it's reason that that governs us, right? Reason governs the passions, reason governs us, and that reason is aligned with divine reason. So a little bit of an alarm should go off. Jeremy Bentham created what he called a philosophic calculator, where he actually added up quantity of pain and pleasure that would result from any given action, and it's sometimes called the hedonistic calculus. And so he had two ledgers and said, okay, how much pleasure, how much pain, and if the pleasure outweighed the pain, then he considered it to be a good action in regard to how much overall pleasure is going to come from it, okay? His most important and significant book was called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Now, that title should immediately say, whoa, this isn't just about individual actions, this is about governance. This is about legislation, and definitely both Bentham and Mill were very politically minded, were definitely wanted their philosophy to influence culture from a law standpoint. Okay, legislation should promote the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people and produce harmony between the interests of society as a whole and those of private individuals. Moral education should appeal to enlightened self-interest. When others feel pleasure, I maximize my own pleasure. Okay, so you're making other people happy ultimately so that I feel happy. Okay, that should raise some warning flags as well. All right, John Stuart Mill, he's the best known English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. And as I mentioned, his father was close friends with Jeremy Bentham. Mill's two famous books were called Utilitarianism, where he kind of tweaked Bentham's utilitarianism a little bit, and also, perhaps even more famous, On Liberty, which dealt with the conflict between minority rights and the rule of a democratic government. He was very much about individual rights, as we will see in this slide right here. Individuals pursuing their own aims is among the essentials of human well-being. And he had this thing called the harm principle, which basically said, with regard to curbing government's power over individuals, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. People should be able to do whatever they like, even at risking their own harm, as long as they do no harm to others. Okay, and again, one of the problems of utilitarianism is that, first of all, it's very simple, and secondly, it sounds great, you know. But if I can just do anything I want, as long as it doesn't harm other people, well, that opens up a bit of a Pandora's box, because that's an argument that's often used in our culture today about, what harm does it do if I do A, B, C, and D? Okay, it's a personal issue. It's just me and one other person, and it doesn't really affect you, so please don't get yourself all tied up in knots about it, okay? Now, here's the kind of the metaphysical, philosophical background and why this is problematic. If you go all the way back to Plato, Plato had the realm of forms, which meant that in addition to what we see here below, which he called shadows, there's a reality which kind of all the things down here below associate with something real up in another realm. Okay, this is what Plato called the realm of forms. Okay, so there was a dogness and catness and butterflyness, and all the butterflies and cats and dogs down here just participated in that universal form, and his greatest form was the good, right? So then St. Augustine came along and said, well, okay, but let's say that realm of forms is in the mind of God, right? It's in God. It's not just kind of abstractly kind of out there somewhere, but all these, the truth of things first exists in the mind of God, and then we go and discover it, and we see representations of things which there is a form in them, according to Aristotle, but ultimately it's in the mind of God, right? But then William of Ockham, 14th century Franciscan philosopher and theologian, came up with what's called nominalism. Okay, so now all of a sudden, there isn't really anything real. There are no universals, like a universal dog or cat, or it's just names we put on it. Okay, so I can't emphasize enough how problematic nominalism is. And we have primarily William of Ockham to blame, although Peter Abelard, who lived before him, didn't help out a whole lot as well. So here's the problem with utilitarianism. It created the subjugation of individuals for the good of the majority with the greatest happiness principle, okay? If there are no universals such as justice, truth, goodness, but only consequences of actions in utilitarianism, no natural moral laws, no absolute moral values could be known to man, and the result was a system of moral relativity, because both Mill and Bentham were nominalists, okay? Neither of them believed in natural law. Neither of them believed in universals or absolutes or objective truth, right? Missing from utilitarian ethics is doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not just based on consequences, right? The very idea that there's a right thing to do in the first place, okay, that actions are morally right or wrong. That's not in the vocabulary of utilitarianism because it's only based on the consequences. Okay, what's called consequentialism. The dignity and intrinsic rights of the individual person is not considered, right? So here's the bottom line. You have acts of justice. You have acts that are right and just, and we fight for acts of justice, right? But a nominalist would say every single one of these acts of justice kind of stands alone. There's no universal form of justice in the Platonic sense. Okay, justice, not all acts of justice conform to one ideal idea of justice, right? Which means that every single one of these acts kind of stand alone and has to be judged individually rather on some kind of universal basis of what makes something just or unjust, right? And what that means is that if we don't have a universal, if we don't have an absolute, if we don't have natural law going for us, every single act of justice has to be judged on its own, and therefore the next logical step is to say, well, let's judge it on its consequences. Okay, what happens when I do this act? And according to the utilitarian, is that if most people are happy because of my act and the fewest people are, sad, or the least amount of pain happens, then it's a good action, all right? Because according to the utilitarians, like Bentham and Mill, there's no other standard by which to judge these actions because there are no universals, thanks to the nominalists. Thank you, William of Ockham. All right, thanks for watching. God bless you.